Welcome everybody back to American Zarathustra. This is episode 45. We are very honored today to have a guest with us who is a colossus in our sphere, a giant. He runs the Scanza Forum, which has had guest speakers such as Greg Johnson, Kevin McDonald, Mark Collette, Mike Enoch, and Jared Taylor. He's actively involved in reviving native Nordic spirituality. Recently, I had the pleasure of being on his film review show called the Decameron Film Festival, which is our crossover point with the Imperium Art Documentary Project. His contributions to the socio-political landscape of European sovereignty and well-being are too numerous to describe. We're deeply grateful for his work. Ladies and gentlemen, Frodi Midjord. How are you today, sir?
Well, that's a very generous introduction. I'm humbled. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the show.
Fabulous. And I'm also happy to have back my friend and co-host, creator of the White Art Collective's Poetry Cast, Conversations with the Wind. How are you, Nullus?
Hi, Donald, and hello, Frodi, and hello to the audience.
Awesome. So, as usual, I always start off with some intros. As an ongoing documentary of the arts in the white identity sphere, we advocate for first-time listeners, but also this is also for kind of archival purposes as well. So we'd like to start off with some introductory questions. If you could tell the audience about how you got started in developing your content and some of the accomplishments that you're most proud of over the years, Frodi.
All right. I've been involved on the right in radical right-wing circles since the late 90s. So I've been going for a couple of decades now. But I really became a public figure, I guess, in 2017. I started my conference organization. I started organizing conferences back in 2015. But at that point, they weren't public. And then they were made public through the mass media. And that wasn't intended, but it was expected. So it came as no surprise that would happen. And at that point, I became more of a public figure and just started doing everything out in public. Whereas before, I'd been more involved behind the scenes. Okay. And what I started doing is I started doing conferences. Probably American listeners will be familiar with things like AMREN, the AMREN conference. So I started doing similar conferences in Scandinavia, that is Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Correct. So we've organized conferences like that in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And we started doing it in 2015 and then started doing it more in public in 2017. And we've had guests like Ricardo Duchesne, Kevin McDonald, Jared Taylor, Greg Johnson, Millennial Woes, the Golden One, Mark Collette, as you mentioned, and pretty much a who's who of the intellectuals on the right, Dutton as well, and many guests. And one of the main things that I wanted to accomplish is to get people to meet up in the real world, because what tends to happen is that sometimes people focus too much on theory and ideas. But one thing that I tend to repeat and sort of a talking point of mine is that humans are only to a very limited extent rational creatures. It's not like we get information and then we calculate all the arguments and the logic and the facts and then we get a political answer. It's more like we are social creatures. Yes. And when the bad guys don't like what we're doing, they attack us on a social level. They try to harm our reputation. They try to say that people shouldn't be associated with us. They try to say that we should be fired from our jobs, things like that harm us in a social way. Yeah. And what we really need is a social community where people actually meet up in the real world and they create real world connections. And when people meet up like that, that is when their life changes in a positive direction, hopefully. They meet up and they can, form a bond, and then they can actually do something in the real world. If it's starting a political project, that's fine. If it's just a social of sort of networking among friends and just building. It's sort of like a family. We're almost like a family. When I go around to all these events in Europe and I speak at events and I organize events myself and have speakers come speak at my events, we're sort of like a family. We know each other. We travel around Europe, and we really have a community that is robust, that can't really be harmed by mainstream political slander, because we have our own standards of what we think is acceptable or not acceptable politics, things like that. So yes, real world meetups was really the first thing that I started organizing in public, and that is the Scanza Forum. And we're definitely going to get going again as soon as we're able to travel within Europe, because right now the borders are still closed because of the COVID situation. We've had to postpone events because of that. And then I also do the Guide to Culture video or podcast channel. And we talk about books, we talk about films, we talk about philosophy. And my main focus, just as you mentioned, Donald, over the last couple of months has been the Decameron Film Festival. That's something I started last year. And I had 40 guests on this time. And we talked about, every guest picked a movie and we talked about it. And so we had 40 live streams over the course of a month and a half.
Awesome.
So I've had a lot of good guests on and put in a lot of work there, but I think it's very valuable, because one thing that I want to do as well is to get away from the purely political, focusing too much on the political, because I think that really soft power is the name of the game these days. It's really the thing that is under the surface and that is underneath politics. Really, I think that is what really matters, and that is culture. And culture is basically our assumptions that we go into. We go into politics with assumptions and with things that are taken for granted, not even talked about explicitly, and that is where the power is. And that is what you get at when you talk about culture. So those are my two main projects: the Scanza Forum and Guide to Culture.
There's an interesting crossover here, because the forum is creating community and then your show is creating culture, and the both meet in a sort of a beautiful way. I love how when we listen to all your guests, for starters, a lot of them are, they talk about politics, history, intellectual things. And then on the show, they get to kind of be more social and talk about movies. And it's kind of, you're right. It's an escape, I think, from the toxic environment that we're in, and it allows us to kind of, rest in more of the zone of friendship and just feel excited about, looking into the creative arts, film, etc., all these different ideas, how they relate to our life. And so I want to thank you actually for having me on your show. So if you could tell the audience about it, I mean, if you could give some highlights, say, for example, say this season, and then let's try to look at how Decameron overlaps into Imperium art. I think that there's an interesting relationship between these two shows.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. And it was, of course, a pleasure to have you on the show. And yes, I do think that one of the things that the mainstream or our political opponents try to do is to say that we are obsessed with politics. We're just filled with hate and we're obsessive people, and that we're unrelatable. And really, in the classical terms of rhetoric, the classics, they talked about ethos, pathos, and logos. And ethos is really relatability. It is, who is the person who is talking? That is his ethos. And is he relatable? Is he a normal person like myself, or is he some kind of weirdo? And really, the way they try to harm us is by saying that we're not relatable. We're these obsessive, angry people. So what I wanted to do was to get these people who are usually associated with politics, I wanted them to talk about something more personal, some film that they find interesting or something. Who are they as a person? And I think that making them more human also makes them more relatable. People understand where they come from and can therefore relate to them more. And The schedule, yeah, like I said, we had 40 guests on. I have the schedule in front of me right now. Keith Woods was the first one, Hypernormalization, First Blood with Morgoth. He talked about the first Rambo film. Let me just see some of the highlights. I really enjoyed Morgoth. He's always a great guest because he's very personal when he talks, and he's very relatable and therefore very likable. As a person. I think that everyone who listens to Morgoth thinks that he's very likable and relatable. So I always enjoy that. The Z-Man, we talked about the man who shot Liberty Valance, which is a classic Western cowboy film. And it really says something about the death of, the Wild West. And that is related to the decline of the West as well. So it's like a cultural, political association there. Semugog, we deconstructed Dogville. That's a sort of high intellectual level. Devon Stack, Black Pilled, we talked about a film called House of Sand and Fog. Another film, Millennial Woes. Let me just see some of the highlights. The Golden One, we talked about Downton Abbey, which is, of course, a TV series that many people will recognize. And it's really about a period in the past when different values were assumed, and people had different values and could assume that others had different values, and it was a period in time that we haven't experienced that we still can be nostalgic about.
What I found really fascinating is the choice of movies from your guests. You think these guys from watching their shows, and then they pick that movie or that show, and I'm like, it's kind of funny. It's kind of fascinating, and I love that it's not all super intellectual. That a lot of the movies were just fun or cool, interesting movies. I tried to bring something totally unique to the table because so many of the guys took all the good movies, but I just tried to bring something to the plate, so to speak.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is one thing that I also like about the schedule, that we had everything from family-friendly films, basically for children. We talked to a lady, Presley Benson. She picked Legend, a film with Tom Cruise from the 80s, film directed at kids, a fantasy film. And then we had, heavy art cinema. So we had, and everything between, we talked about Predator, the action film from the 80s, and Aliens, and then we talked about heavier art cinema as well. So we had everything, really. We covered the entire spectrum. Another favorite episode of mine on this festival was Academic Agent. He talked about There Will Be Blood.
Oh, I love that film. Huge fan.
It was it's amazing, and the conversation was absolutely amazing. Academic Agent isn't really, he's a right winger. I don't really know where he stands politically. I think he's more of a sort of a libertarian, something like that, conservative libertarian. And we talked about things in terms of capitalist archetypes, these kinds of people who build an empire, and the psychology behind that, and the political context of that.
Taking that lens on the film is quite powerful and quite fascinating, especially if you think of the literature of that day, The Great Gatsby, and these other, just that turn of the century industrial age. It's quite amazing because the film is so realistic. You feel like it's a time machine, and you went right back. Daniel Day-Lewis's performance is over the top amazing. Even the little boy in the film who goes deaf. I mean, it was just heart-wrenching and intense. And then there's just so much to say about it. But I would encourage our viewers, or rather our listeners, to go check out the Decameron Film Festival. You've just got hours and hours of wonderful content there. And it clearly overlaps, right, in the arts, the culture, the analysis. I want to pass the mic real quick to Nullus and let him chime in a bit.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add that, just to throw in my 2 cents, Frodi, that your work has been invaluable, and it has really brought great results. I personally have thoroughly enjoyed the debates, the cultural reviews, and your guests essentially come from every corner of our sphere. So we really get to see a cross-section of every idea, every thought, every interpretation that's out there. And I think that that's a very important message for us to properly contextualize where we stand in this whole thing. And I fully agree that we need more real life events. So hats off to you for being one of the first to really organize these things, and that's an important thing that we need to emulate. I would say, of course, what would be very interesting is also looking at these, and you've done this very successfully, where you've bridged this gap between the Americas and Europe, and I think that we really need to focus on that more. I would like to see more interaction between continental European nationalist movements and those movements both in the Anglosphere and the Americas, and also in the Scandinavian countries. I think that we need to sort of focus and bolster this brotherhood of European man, and hopefully we will be able to do that over time. And I fully agree with you that culture is where we can win, and that's really where our focus should lie. And in many ways, we have to build from scratch, so it's really difficult. At the same time, we want to preserve those things that were taken away from us and find ways to recontextualize it, reanimate it, if you will. But as far as movies are concerned, I would just say that maybe one day you'll be able to review movies created by our very own artists and filmmakers. Now, that's something I would love to see.
Indeed.
Absolutely. That's the obvious next step that, we want to, we don't want to just comment on culture. We want to create it as well. But I think that starting the conversation is a good way to motivate people to also start creating. And another thing that I wanted to do, just like you mentioned, across the entire spectrum, is that I don't want to stay in the political ghetto, if you get my point. I don't want to just talk to people who have predictable opinions. I want to talk to people, and I've tried to do this as well. I've had people who don't agree with me politically. I've had people like Gilad Atzmon, and I've had others on the show just to break out of the reservation a little bit. And to get to talk to other people and not make it so predictable. It's more interesting if we talk to people that we might not agree with 100% about politics or culture, things like that.
Well, we have to always question ourselves, challenge ourselves. That's Donald will probably say this, but I'm going to sort of take this away from Donald. But we want everyone to challenge us here at Imperium Art. So, and I think that's really important. We need to challenge ourselves so that we can grow and have mature and intelligent conversations, even with those people with whom we might not agree.
And this ties into the community building and the culture building theme as well. So it's all very important. I often say to people or on my show that the mission comes first, and we do have such a diversity of thought, but we all have the same goal, which is, of course, our sovereignty, our survival. So I just advocate for putting that first and then figuring things out as we go. But as far as real life events is concerned, the White Art Collective, which we represent, had an extremely huge announcement regarding a real life event coming up soon. So we will we'll just leave a teaser right there for the audience, and then we'll get into that a bit more in the future. But I'd like to take the conversation a little bit of a different direction. I've had an ongoing discussion with the hosts of Hearth of Europa and also with Dave Martell about how to practice indigenous spirituality, indigenous European spirituality. I'm deeply interested in understanding what I call the spiritual technology of these traditions. And so, this could be the topic of another show or a whole series, honestly. But I wanted to ask you, how, first off, maybe if you could just kind of give a brief description of, what it is you practice spiritually and how it works. And then I want to try to relate that to the arts and ask, how do the arts play a role in that practice?
Absolutely. I can just say, to wrap up the Cameron Film Festival, if I could recommend people who haven't heard of the Cameron Film Festival or my channel to just watch one episode to get going, I would probably suggest that you check out the episode I did with Ricardo Duchesne, who is a professor of sociology in Canada. We did a show about Africa Audio, which is a film from 1966 about the decolonization of Africa. I think we had a fantastic conversation about that film. So if I can just recommend one episode to just get the ball rolling, just get people interested, that's the one I would pick. When it comes to my involvement in spirituality, that is something that I will talk much more about on my channel in upcoming weeks and months and years. And because now we've talked so much about films that I want to take things in a different direction. I'm not going to abandon films entirely, but I'm going to focus more on other things. And one of those things is spirituality. And it's difficult to discuss religion and spirituality when, because our culture and our assumptions are so saturated with the Christian archetypes or the Christian style of religion that people tend to assume that, if you believe in another religion than Christianity, for example, then it's basically Christianity, but you replace God with Odin and Jesus with Thor or something like that, right? Yeah. It becomes a bit of a parody, but what I want to say is that is definitely not the case. It is completely different altogether, and that is a huge topic. It's a topic that sort of needs its own episodes, probably hours. It's a huge topic, but essentially what motivated me and has motivated me for many years is that I was always alienated from the modern world. I never felt at home in the modern world. And that is not only because of mass immigration or anything like that. It's because of the values and the assumptions and what we think is important in our current culture. And I was alienated by that. I didn't feel at home. I didn't feel that doesn't jive with me. Those values that are in our current modern society.
Okay.
And what I really did was that I went back to the history of our people, the history of Scandinavia. And the further back I went, the more and more home I could feel. I could relate more to the values and the mentality and the attitudes of what my ancestors believed in and what they talked about and what they felt was important. And that's really at the core of why I started to cultivate a deep interest and a deep respect for that spirituality and that history and that culture, because all those things are really a part of one thing. You can't really separate them completely or discreetly from each other. So yeah, it was really about finding home. It was finding a place that I could relate to and where I felt like this is my home in a spiritual way, that these are the values that I think are true. And that is really what it's been about for me all the time.
Mm-hmm. So what's the use of art, music, dance in the rituals or the practice of what you practice? I don't know is it Odinism? Is it Asatru? What name does it go by?
Yeah, this is obviously all names like that are somewhat artificial because they weren't used by our ancestors. So those are just terms. You could call it paganism. You could call it anything you like. Really, it's a designator, and all those names are artificial because they're created afterwards. They're created from the outside and not really from the inside. Because from the inside, all these things were taken for granted. They weren't talked about. It's sort of like, before people like to say, and you'll hear mainstream intellectuals say that nationalism was invented in the French Revolution or in the late 1700s or 1800s. No, it wasn't invented. It was simply taken for granted before that, and people started talking about it at that point. That doesn't mean that it was invented at that point.
Yeah,
to that point, I just want to add that if we look at what's happening today, how they take our terms, our virtues, and our understanding of ourselves, and then twist it and give us an inverse understanding of what we organically understand as truth, then it also would be fair to assume that liberalism in the 18th and 19th century, humanism before that, also took organic understanding of ethnos and twisted it and created an inverse understanding of itself. So I've always been of the school of thought that nationalism is a primordial reality and an organic reality that has existed with us going back to antiquity. So I just wanted to just add this point to what Frodi was saying.
If I can tag on to that as well, which is beautifully said, Nullus, our enemies do not have the right to redefine our indigenous symbols and then sell it back to us as evil in some regard. They have their own cultural symbols, religious symbols. We have ours, and we define those things. So we have to try to always, realize and get our people out of the mindset that these symbols have some dark meaning to them or something, or other they're associated with whatever Hollywood tells you about history. So anyway, I want to pass the mic back to Frodi and let him continue.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that you're both making very important points there. One of the I gave a speech at an online conference earlier this year in late February, and that speech is also posted on my channel on Guide to Culture. The speech is called the Tribal Conquest of Earth. The Tribal Conquest of Earth. And it's really one of the cornerstones of my ideology or my philosophical or ideological outlook. So anyone who wants to listen to it can watch it there. The Tribal Conquest of Earth on Guide to Culture. And really one of the things that I talk about there is how ancient and primordial tribalism is. That we are hardwired to live in tribes and be loyal to our own kind, and sometimes get into conflicts with outgroups. That is totally natural. And one thing that I bring up there is, from the vast scientific literature, is that even chimpanzees are territorial. They have tribes, they defend their territory, and sometimes they get into territorial conflicts and disputes with other tribes and get into wars. There is fascinating literature about a war that had been going on for 15 years, or maybe even more. I forget how many years, but many, many years between one tribe of chimpanzees and another tribe of chimpanzees in Africa, where they were, like humans, nations, fighting over territory and defending their territory, defending their resources against another tribe. And that is what nationalism is. We defend our in-group, and sometimes we get into conflicts with out-groups. Every other people in the world, every other race in the world takes this for granted, but it's evil when we do it. And what I want to say is that, no, this isn't something that was invented in the 1700s or 1800s or any other time. This is something that is prehistoric. This is hardwired into our being and to who we are, that we are tribal and we are social. We're not individuals. We are social, and we protect our people. We're not egoistic individuals. That is what was invented in the 17 or 1800s, right?
Exactly.
The idea of the individual. So it's the inverse of what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that nationalism was invented during the French Revolution. No, it wasn't. It is the idea of this abstract individual that is what has been invented, because tribalism is hardwired. It's primordial and it's prehistoric.
Mm-hmm. This ties into so many topics. We're talking about community building, culture building, this tribal nature of nationalism. It's sort of, I guess, a trifecta, at least in this conversation. And so I feel that one can inform the other. We've been having many discussions throughout the show about these various things, and the problem of say, pathological altruism, and how whites in general are kind of hypnotized into this kind of individualism, this sense which is anti-community per se, right? And so I think this is helping us to define that this is a goal or a mission, a directive for Imperium art and for the whole movement, is to use the arts to develop stronger sense of our tribalism, our indigenous European tribalism, to have a greater sense of our identity as a demographic, and to celebrate that as well through the arts. So it's an interesting vehicle for these ideas as well, and I, for example, I take Jason Kuhn's dialectics and I put it in the lyrics of my songs, so that people will hear something go free or whatever it might be. And then later, it kind of sinks into their heart in a deeper sort of way, which echoes back what you were saying about how we're not these logical machines, that we're social animals. I certainly agree with that. I think that's been our problem so far, as we've been trying to rationalize our way out of this, and it hasn't worked, But as far as it, I don't know how deep you want to go into this, because it's obviously a very intimate and personal topic about one's spirituality. Well, I guess I am curious about where the arts, in your opinion, overlap into Norse spirituality.
Well, art is something that is the interesting thing about art, and films especially, but all art. But I think films are so at the forefront of how we see culture today, and that's why I've given so much attention to them on my channel, the films. And it is really interesting because films are a projection of what we take for granted, and the things that are in films is the message that is interesting that is in films is really the things that are not stated. What you can read between the lines, what is assumed here, which assumptions, and what is simply, what flies under the radar here. And I think that is where you can find values, and that is where the interesting values, and those are the values that govern society. And that's why deconstructing culture or deconstructing films about culture, or that are an expression of culture, that is why that is such an interesting thing to do, and that's what we've done. And you can see pagan themes in many films, in the films of Ingmar Bergman, for example. One film that is one of my favorite films of all time is The Virgin Spring. It's a film about revenge. It's a fantastic film. There are so many films that are that are a reflection of ancient, primordial, I would say, European spirituality, and different ways of seeing that. There's a Czech film called Markéta Lazarova, which is really about the transition from pagan Europe to Christian Europe in the Middle Ages, and these are things that you can see them, but it's not all. You can't always put them into words because they're on such a primordial level. But there are definitely films that deal with spiritual themes and pagan themes. One very popular film that deals with paganism, for example, is the classic from 1973, The Wicker Man, with Christopher Lee.
Right.
Which is a film about a policeman who goes out into an island in Scotland where to investigate a murder, and it appears that on this island they're pagan. Everyone is pagan on this island, and it's an interesting play on the fantasy of how a sort of an authentic pagan society looks, or what kind of values they have. But really, what paganism is ancestor worship. It's a form of vitalism that is a celebration of the forces of life, and it's a cyclical worldview. Whereas in the modern world, we have a linear view of how history works, that we go from worse to better, right? It's we make progress. We always make progress, and in the sort of Marxist lingo, they say that some countries are left behind. Well, you can't really be left behind, right? I mean, we're not going anywhere. We're here. We're not heading in a direction, really. We're in some sort of improvement, and some people are left behind. We have to help them catch up, because we always have to go in the. No, it's a crazy way of looking at the world, and really this goes back to the way people lived before the big cities and industrialization. People lived on farms, and what do you do on farms? Well, you harvest, and things go in cycles, and you get the winter, you get summer, and all years they're just a cycle, and it's just a repetition of the same. And that is what life is. Life doesn't go in a certain direction. It just is what it is, and we can live with it and accept it and love it, or we can have this manic obsession about progress and going somewhere. It's an erratic impulse that is, it's double-edged. It has its positive values as well, but I think that somewhere along the line, somewhere along this journey, we got lost.
Let me relate with you on this particular topic. I lived in Asia for 5 years, and I was surrounded by and absorbed with and deeply studying their indigenous cultures. And I learned all about these indigenous ways and these ideas. Some years later, I did educational counseling for the Iroquois Native American Tribal Council, and I learned about their indigenous ways. And I finally came up with this concept of seeing that there's two worlds in this world, and one is the indigenous world and the other is the Abrahamic world. And I'm not making judgments about those things, but I'm saying they're very, very different worlds, and maybe one's overlapping the other. It would be interesting to see how and where they could maybe organically meet. But what you're saying here is of such critical and central importance to the Imperium, to the spirit of our European brotherhood, that we sort of settle back out of push away modernism or modernity back into our natural roots, into these cycles, the sense of family, the continuity between our ancestors and the future generations that we sire. So it's very fulfilling, honestly, to hear you talk about this. And I guess this is kind of a very key topic in terms of the arts, because we have obviously a lot of artists, musicians, etc., that listen to the show. This show is very much for the White Art Collective as well as our community. And I try to, pull out the gold in these conversations, to mine the gold. And I think we just came up with a good big nugget of gold here, saying try to create indigenous symbols or reconnect with or use indigenous values, symbols, art, etc. Anything that you can to integrate into our current Imperium art, so that it's embodying this spirit of these things that you're talking about. We do see, like I said, the black sun is the Sonnengrad is a very popular symbol now. And I remember when it was like, "Ooh, that's so hush hush," like the ADL tells us we can't put that on Facebook or something. It's like so. But now it's just more and more and more, and I think we have to reclaim these symbols and just glorify them and show them out for the beautiful things that they are. And I do want to quickly hand the mic to Nullus, let him respond.
I would just add the point of continuity, and I find that to be an ongoing theme in our Imperium art conversations. And what I find fascinating is how each European tradition has somewhat of a different historic experience, and how that ties into their spirituality, how that ties into their respective continuities and understanding of themselves. My background being Hungarian, we contextualize ourselves somewhat differently. We try to incorporate the continuity of our pagan past through into the Christian historic experience, through the understanding of fulfillment of Christianity as a complementary component as opposed to an opposing component of this continuity. And again, every experience is different. Everyone has somewhat of a different interpretation in with regard to this. I think that it is very important for us to always grow, move forward. I'm not necessarily against technology as a tool. I think that every tool is some kind of advancement of technology, whether that's a hammer or a jackhammer. So we have to look at those as tools. Where we need to ground ourselves would be with the virtues that our ancestors have passed on to us. And when those virtues are severed from our continuity, that's where I see that we have a lot of difficulty in mastering these tools, where these tools become our masters, so to speak. So I think that, this aspect of our understanding, both culturally, spiritually, and also in our artistic expression, because any way we slice it, technology will always influence our artistic expression as it does today with the internet, with various forms of expression through media. So I think that we need to master these tools and not let these tools master us. That would just be an addition, I think, to what both of you were saying.
So let me continue then. Well, I want to move on to a different topic here. It's not different, it's related, but it's a little more specific. So there's been a great deal of momentum with the White Art Collective in producing white positive arts and culture since we started about 3 years ago. And it's a very lively community that has done a lot for the overall mental health and morale of our people in the movement, which is something that we need so much, So, we have the D-Live shows every week, and there's several a week. We've got new announcements coming that are even bigger. We're growing, connecting with people like you, Frodi, Mark Collette. It's all these different spheres. And so we have an ongoing discussion on how to expand our audience and what role the arts should take in the broader movement. So my question, Frodi, is, in your view, how best could the arts serve our goals in the white identity movement? How can we manifest that or weaponize it in some way?
Yeah, I think there are many ways of doing that, but I think there are some principles that are interesting. And one of the episodes that we had on the Decameron Film Festival was Jim Goad. He talked about Billy Jack, a film from 1971. You might have seen it.
Well, I do martial arts. I'm a kung fu teacher, actually, so that's a whole other.
One of the interesting scenes in that film, in Billy Jack, is they go to this hippie collective or hippie commune or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And one of the things they do there is an interesting scene. It's they're trying to teach the Indians, that is the Native Americans, some racial pride. And the art teacher says, paint something that makes you proud of your heritage. And I think that's really a great way of looking at it. And, my thought when I heard that line was, why don't we do that?
Yeah.
Why don't our people do that?
Yeah.
And I think that there is autism is like an overused word in our circles, but I think that sometimes when we try to create culture, it becomes too mechanical and quote unquote autistic. And you'll see books like the Turner Diaries or whatever that is too in your face political. And like I've said repeatedly before, that I think that art and culture is most effective when it hits you between the lines. It's the assumptions. It's what's lying under the surface. So I think that what right-wingers need to learn in order to be effective at creating art is to create something that isn't too in your face, and to do something that is a bit more subtle, but doing something about ancestral pride. Painting, doing music about, or doing films about things from our history that when we were great, when we weren't sissies, when we weren't pushed around.
Yeah.
That is a fantastic way of awakening something in our spirit. So that is one thing, doing something about our history that isn't explicitly political, but everyone understands the political implications of that. We were actually once a proud race, and we weren't always these weaklings who were, racial cuckolds. We weren't always like that. And there's a lot in our history that we can take pride in. So, that is one way. Another thing is something that I think that the left did in the 60s and 70s. And there are many of these bands, prog bands, other bands, rock bands from the 60s and 70s that were leftist, but, 90% of their music wasn't about politics. It was about love. It was about drinking. It was about partying. It was about life. It was about getting fired from your job or whatever. And then, it was a little bit of politics sprinkled in here and there. So it was sort of an assumption. It wasn't in your face all the time, and it wasn't strident. It wasn't pushy. And there's something to be said for having a more seductive attitude rather than this pushy attitude.
Yeah.
And it could be made more subtle. So if there's one thing I can wish for people who want to create right-wing art is, don't be too in your face. Do it more implicit and between the lines, and make it a natural part of life rather than, it's first politics and then art. No, it has to be art first, and then the politics comes into the art.
You're touching on a very sensitive nerve, per se, in the white art community, white art collective, per se, in that this is a really central aesthetic question for each and every one of us individually. If you listen to, Jody Kay's songs versus Olivia Key's songs, or Hyrith, or my songs, or Nullus's poetry, I think is exemplary as far as like, talking about these things. But we've had this discussion before, like, how do you make white art, per se? And then, there's this notion that you're white and you make art. You're indigenous and you make your indigenous art. It's like the cathedrals or the statues or the concertos, etc. They just came from the European biospirit. They weren't like making a specific political statement. So whereas, speaking for myself, and I think I can assume most people in the White Art Collective have some, I could speak for them to an extent, I am making art and music about our movement. It is, it's explicitly about our movement. I can write a love song, I can write a song about, rock and roll, party, something fun, whatever. But, it's a very fine line. It's really, it's actually painful to kind of ride that line and think like, don't go too far off the end, because now it's cringe. If you get too explicit, then you're actually turning the audience off, or turning them away. And you can't do that. You got to pull back. But at the same time, don't be vague. Don't be afraid to be who you are, or to say it's okay to be white or something like that. So we're early in these stages of the development of this so-called Imperium art. So and I think each one of us, we struggle with these things. If you listen to the band Mamas and the Pepes, they take a humorous approach to that, and they're really good at it. Like that's their thing. I could never do that. I couldn't write a comedy song. But the kind of parodies they do on politics are cutting. They're really vicious sometimes, but at the same time funny. So anyway, it's a really extremely critical topic, and you really focused right in on it.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And I'm not trying to tell anyone what to do. I'm just saying that, I look at the left is so dominant in culture now. And why are they so dominant? What did they do in the 60s and 70s when they really took off, right?
Yeah.
And there's something to be said for that approach and looking at what actually works. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that, some right-wingers, they think that, they're politically motivated. They don't really care about art, but some say that, well, we need art, so let's create some art. Sometimes it works. But what I'm saying is that sometimes the art has to come first, and then the politics will come in naturally, sort of, through the back door in a way.
This is a good approach. I apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then there is, the question of who are you making this for? Right-wingers are often sort of preaching to the choir in a way. Yeah. But what I think is interesting, and what they did in the 60s, these bands that weren't explicitly political, but everyone knew that, they weren't conservative. If you make music like, I don't know, like Janis Joplin, I don't know, the people who were popular in the 60s and 70s, did they always talk about politics? No, they didn't. It was like, if you throw in like a political song, every 10th song is more political, well, then you can sort of expand your sphere a little bit, and you're breaking out of the reservation. I'm always focused on sort of breaking out of the reservation.
Nice.
Talking to people on the other side in a way. And I think there's a lot to that. And I want to give you one example that I think is highly effective when it comes to right-wing art. And that is the neo-folk scene. I don't know if you're very familiar with with neo-folk.
Sure.
Yeah. And the point is that neo-folk as a genre is inherently right-wing, in my opinion. It's implicitly right-wing, but inherently right-wing. But what you'll find is that most of the people actually behind the music, they will protest and say, no, I'm a left-winger, I'm this or that. But if you do music that is sentimental about European history or your people's history, and you make music about, traditions, you make music about our culture, it's inherently political. It's inherently right-wing. It doesn't matter if the guy making the music calls himself left wing. He's going to be dragged along with the art. The art calls the shot.
Well said. Beautifully said. Let's let Nullus respond.
No, I fully agree with that. I mean, I know a lot of people who are in this folk scene, whether it's the neo folk scene or the traditional folk scene, who profess very left-wing kind of progressive ideas and protest constantly about how open-minded they are. I mean, I've had debates with many people from this background, so it's like, and you're absolutely right, Frodi. I mean, it's like, well, whatever you say is irrelevant because what you're representing is the wellspring of our culture. You are preserving the wellspring of our culture, so you have, what your opinion is irrelevant to the art that you're producing, and it is kind of ironic in a way that you hear that often among these artists. I maybe, if I could, just add that I think that regardless of what kind of expression, whether it's implicit, whether it's explicit, whether it's traditional, I think that the goal should always be to strive towards excellence and to always be a better artist. If we're going to produce art that's for us, and when I say for us, I mean all of us, even those people that don't agree with us, and are still a part of our family. When we're going to produce art for everyone in that sense, but maintain our virtues, maintain our core, then we have to be excellent at it. We have to produce quality work. If we don't produce quality work, then we're basically we're doing a disservice to the overall goal of what we want to achieve.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Yeah, this I find it very interesting how we learn as we go too. This is a process where we're talking to each other. That's what this show is about. I always talk about co-authoring the Imperium art project. That's we want to get everybody's input on it. We want them to critique what it is we're doing, how we're doing it, and all of these different voices, these different approaches come together to kind of sort of bake it into the pie, and it's got all these flavors. But we're closing in on what it is we do, how we do it, and it's its own unique thing. It's quite beautiful. What's fascinating though is that we have so much, I guess I hate using this word diversity, or variety. Okay, we have so much variety of music and mediums. So we're just trying to build our community more, and then again, this program is a reference point for our artists and our thinkers, our cultural influencers, to come and say, what is it that we're doing? Who are we? How are we moving forward as a culture and a community, which then has a political mission? So all of these things that kind of tie together in a sort of a spectrum, I think. So it's quite wonderful, and this is actually a perfect segue right into discussing the Imperium art essay. So I didn't know if you wanted to let Nullus lead, or if you had a few comments you wanted to make before we get into that.
Sure, I can do that. And I just want to emphasize that I don't think it's wrong to make explicitly political art per se, but I think it's important to try to expand your horizon a bit, and to not only preach to the choir, but also create a bridge to the outside world. And I think that's really where the magic happens. And I think that's, sometimes you look at art films and they're really sort of, it's like they're really niche. They're really talking to their niche in a way. But what really happens, and where the magic happens, is like when someone like David Lynch, for example, creates a film. He was, a sort of avant-garde artist, started out as that. But when he tries to make something that connects to the outside world, then it becomes a masterpiece. And I think that is, sort of try to when you try to break out of the reservation and try to talk to outsiders. I think that is really when when you have to rethink things in a little bit in order to communicate better, I think that is when you force yourself to do that. I think some magic can happen. So I think there's room for both things, implicitly political and explicitly political. I definitely think so.
Yes.
Everybody has different tastes as well. So some people are going to gravitate to my music and others won't. And I do try to act as an example, though, to show the courage to be able to talk about this, because that's the climate we're in. When we're out of this climate and everybody's talking about white well-being, it won't be necessary anymore.
No, absolutely. And what I want to say is that, I mean, I'm not even familiar with most of the people involved right now in the White Art Collective. What I'm critiquing more is the old movement. I was a part of the whole thing when it was a skinhead movement in the 90s. Right. And the thing is that when people created music back then, like skinhead music, and it was like very explicitly subcultural, right? The point is that people from the outside didn't get it. And that's really what I was missing back then. And hopefully, probably we've gotten a long way since then. But yeah, I can't really say anything specifically about what's going on right now, because there's a bunch going on that I haven't seen.
Well, you've got a wonderful smorgasbord of arts to enjoy in the coming days. So let's shake it over to the Imperium art essay. I don't know if you wanted to comment on what you've read of it, or if we could let Nullus lead. What would you prefer?
Yeah, just go ahead and
take the list.
So I think the best way to put it is to go to the section here in the beginning where I list the elements of Imperium art. And I have 6 elements that I've listed in the essay. The first one is repositioning the soul of the European man in Imperium art. The second one is contextualizing ethnos, mythos, and logos in Imperium art. And the third is the collaboration of the continuum through the Imperium. The fourth is cognitive dominance in the culture insurgency. The fifth is the dialectics of artistic violence. And the sixth one is the transcendental idealism of the Imperium. And I believe that we spoke quite a bit about the repositioning of the soul of the European man in Imperium art in our conversation so far. I also believe that we've addressed the contextualizing the ethnos, the mythos, and the logos in Imperium art. I think that these aspects have been covered in our in our conversation. The collaboration of the continuum through the Imperium, we touched upon this a little bit, where we talked about finding ways to connect the various different European traditions to find common ground, perhaps an overarching theme, perhaps a space where you can have someone from Scandinavia collaborate and work together on an artistic level with someone from, say, Italy or Spain or France or what have you, or the United States. So maybe let's talk about that for a second. What would your opinion be? I mean, in the essay, I'll just jump right to the essay itself. Let me go to that section. There's a point here where I speak about, and I'm going to read this section here. It's just one paragraph. It's above these components lies the realization of unity through the Imperium, where Europeans can enrich each other with their respective organic identities. Imperium art creates awareness where Europeans find common solidarity through the Imperium and attempts to bridge a gap among the various interpretations of European identity. Imperium art is not to be conflated with the concept of empire in the political context. Instead, it creates an existential location of cultural convergence, where all our respective traditions are equally celebrated, cherished, and respected. Visually, Imperium art is best represented by the Norse berserker fighting alongside the Teutonic knight, the Celtic warrior fighting alongside the Roman legionnaire, the Hussite soldier fighting alongside the crusader, the Magyar horse archer fighting alongside the German man-at-arms, and so on. And maybe, Frodi, if you could comment on your impression, at least on that paragraph, that might be a good way to start this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is, I think it's very valuable to get out of your comfort zone and what you know, and go somewhere else to find inspiration. And I think that if you just look at many of the great artists of the past, they went somewhere else, to a different country, to study, and they become an apprentice, and then they came home and they painted. They took those techniques, or took that tradition, and then they made a local interpretation of that in their own homeland and in their own local culture. And that is, again, that's like an intersection where the magic happens. Because really, creativity, in order to be creative and in order to create art, you have to, it's like you're forced to always break out of habits. You can't, everything that is predictable, that is habitual, that is in a way an obstacle to creativity. You have to see something else to get inspiration, in order to create something new, right? You have to get out of your mental habits. And definitely, I think there's a lot to be said about that, going, and it's not just in art. If you go to a new country and see a new local culture, it creates a lot of ideas in your head, and you can reinterpret the things that happen at home, in the place that you're more familiar with, through a new. You can compare the patterns of what's going on, and you can understand things better. So yeah, I definitely think that a sort of a pan-European cross-fertilization of culture and inspiration is absolutely essential.
It's fascinating. I regularly watch Hearth of Europa, and Links in the Shadows is a phenomenal shows where they draw upon various, primarily Anglo and Scandinavian traditions and folk tales, and it's really riveting. And so my hat's off to the ladies. Just wanted to throw that in there. But what I find fascinating there is that I see a lot of parallels within my own tradition. So like, we'll talk about, I think at one point we were talking about the Krampus, for example, and how that was understood in Central Europe as opposed to similar kind of tropes and mythologies in Scandinavia. And you see a lot of interesting parallels, and everyone understands these as their own ancient tradition. And to me, by understanding each other better as a European brotherhood, so to speak, we also learn that we're not that much different in many ways. And I think that's an important point of trying to bring us all closer together through art and through our collaborations. Let me ask you about this part here. This is a somewhat controversial passage. This is the cognitive dominance in culture, in the culture insurgency. And I make I start off by saying that we have lost the culture war, and that we must now utilize different strategies to focus on the realities of a culture or a cultural insurgency. And so I use the psychological concept of cognitive dominance as a part of the artistic expression to understand, and I'll read this part here as what cognitive dominance is and how we can utilize this in our artistic expression. Cognitive dominance is a term that has been used by both the medical and the military establishments to conquer fear in the face of extremely stressful situations. Mark McLaughlin, MD, developed a cognitive dominance assessment to understand the way in which the human brain experiences unanticipated stress. In military terms, cognitive dominance is defined along historic examples where commanders that attained cognitive dominance were those that could navigate the fog of war in order to decipher meaning in a sea of noise and convey this meaning to others. The military goal is to secure an intellectual advantage over an adversary by mastering situational awareness, deep personal study, and a focus on visualization. Cognitive dominance in Imperium art presents a cerebral and masculine message, which provides an answer to how the artist can create effective strategies to help balance their emotions and overcome external pressures. Like the military commander, the artist must learn to uncover meaning in the contemporary tumult of cultural degeneracy, while having the ability to clearly convey their message to the audience. Through understanding the dimensions of the dialectics of artistic violence, which is my next passage, The warrior poet manifests the approach by which an artist can effectively achieve cognitive artistic dominance in the culture insurgency. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've never thought about that before in those terms. Absolutely, but I think that we are in a situation, and this is something that I've talked about many times before on my channel. And there is a sort of there's this sort of Spenglerian cycle, right? And where people in power, they become soft because they have no challenges, they have no resistance, they have nothing to fight for. And what has happened on the left is that they have become so comfortable and spoiled, whereas we have been under constant pressure. I mean, if you put your face out there and you you get attacked, viciously attacked internationally for just being a guy stating your opinions or speaking your mind, like I do, for example. I mean, it's bizarre, really, the way you get persecuted. But that also creates a dynamic that is very interesting, and that is that we become very anti-fragile because it's sort of like Bane,
Yeah, right.
I was born in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just a guest here. This is welcome to my world, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that in many developments in recent years, where anything that we're anti-fragile, whereas they are fragile because they've had no resistance. And you can see that when Trump won. I mean, that's it's a relatively trivial thing that Trump won the election in 2016, but they were crying. They broke down mentally. They're so fragile because they've been so spoiled. It's sort of like, they say that when you have like a pet, like a pet rabbit or a pet little animal or whatever, right? You have it in a cage, you feed it, and then if you release it out into nature, it's gonna die in a day or two because it doesn't it's not capable, because you've spoiled it. It's not capable of surviving in the wild anymore.
Yeah.
It's been domesticated, and that's what happened with our cultural opponents. They've become so spoiled, and they're lazy, and they're no longer. They don't have, they're not made of the stuff that's needed to fight. And whereas we are constantly attacked, and there's a hardness, there's a toughness about us because we have never had an easy day. When I create a conference, when I organized a conference in Oslo in 2019, the security service, the intelligence service came there, and left-wingers were outside protesting, trying to attack people. They talked about us in Chinese media. That's how big this thing was.
Wow.
And we were just constantly attacked. And it's like, well, everyone thought this is actually pretty cool, We're actually in a real world situation, and it's global news, and we're the biggest news in the country. And it's like, we can weather the storm. But left-wingers, like someone says boo to them, and they fall apart.
Yeah, that's where we can win. And Donald, I'll just finish it just by saying that with a pun, I'll finish it with a pun, that they don't possess the right stuff.
Our heart. Very good. You get the dad joke award today.
Okay.
It's funny because the term white fragility, they invented it, but it's actually about them. It's not about us. It just occurred to me. But to echo back on the topic of cognitive dominance, Nullus was explaining or discussing situational awareness. Now, that's what we've been talking about on this whole show. And Frodi, you specifically have really broadened the scope of our situational awareness. You're contributing so much to this documentary, the Imperium Art documentary. So I'm very, very grateful for your contributions. And of course, thank you on behalf of everybody who listens to the show as well. So this I think needs to be something that we have to kind of break out of our individualism and think more like a collective. and think more like a community and have situational awareness. And I think as the more that we do that, the more we'll grow in our numbers, we'll grow in strength, and then, we'll be able to kind of win this culture war. But I think, specifically calling out to the artists, creators, musicians, etc., if you could integrate that situational awareness into the themes of your art, that would help tremendously. So I'm just, again, that's a kind of an overview that I do. It's sort of my job on the show, in a sense, is to try to tie all these things together and to kind of like create like a summary in some sense of like, where have we gone today? What have we done with this conversation? What are the the benefits or the conclusions that we've come to? So on that point, I'd like to say, maybe if you'd like to offer some closing thoughts, Frodi, what are your hopes for or your future visions for the arts in our movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of where we are now, I think that the left, or let's just call them the left, the globalists, the politically correct establishment, but, left is a shorthand, right?
Yes.
And they have become comfortable. They've become comfortable in their seat, and they're now defensive. And I think it's interesting. And one of the things that I do on my channel is we deconstruct films. Deconstructing, that is what the left used to do when they were, attacking. Now they're defending their position, their political, cultural position. And now we're attacking. We're the ones deconstructing. And we're the ones, using the best of their intellectual history in a way. They're old. We can use the Frankfurt School against them. We can use anything against them.
Yes.
I mean, I love reading old left-wing intellectuals, philosophers, writers from when they were sharp. They were intellectually dominant in the 60s and 70s, and now they're clowns. I mean, a mediocre right-winger on our side can destroy the best guy they have.
Yep.
Yeah, well said.
And that didn't always used to be the case. When in the heyday of, I don't know, Noam Chomsky, someone like that, they were quite sharp, but they're not anymore. Yeah, and I think that is really where we're going now, that we are the ones who have the intellect on our side, and the sharpness and the sort of will to power, and we're the ones deconstructing their power now. And I think that's just a step, a natural step in the direction of this sort of circulations of elites, where the old lazy elite, which is now the leftist elite, is sort of on the way down. Their power is being undermined because we have all the quality on our side.
Well said.
I want to tag on to that, this sharpness, this dialectic, this ability to compete and to grow, and our will to power. I feel that it's important that we're training more people on the right wing that are more, heading towards, say, the moderates, to train them in these ideas, in our dialectic, in the true history of our people, our true culture, our indigenous values, etc., our community. And so to bring them in, and I feel the arts is the way to do that. So again, all this stuff is just tying together seamlessly. So I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today, Frodi. Of course, your link tree is going to be below the show, and it's in the chat as well. I'd like, if you want to, maybe if there's any other things you'd like to announce, places where people can find you, upcoming announcements.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you guys. It's been a pleasure to be on your show. And yes, if people want to find me, my website is gtkmedia.org, and the best place to follow me right now is on Telegram. And well, you can find all the links in the link tree and everything, but the Telegram is Guide to Culture, and culture has an eccentric spelling. It's from an Ezra Pound book from the 1930s, and it's Kulchur. So Kulchur, Guide to Culture. And that's my Telegram, and that's probably the best place to follow me. But yeah, go to the link tree and check it out. Beautiful. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you.
Tremendously, yes. And so everybody, please, the routine, share, subscribe, and comment. And thank you so much. We'll see you next time on Imperium Art.